Hello, computer world. This is Mr. Beller coming at you. Today we are going to discuss the relationship between England and her colonies. We will look at the economic relationship, and then we will dive a little bit deeper and look at the unique characteristics of some of the uh, colonial regions. And hopefully by the end of it, we will be able to answer a couple questions here, namely one, how did political events in England affect the lives of colonists? Just looking at this introduction slide, what were two examples of self-governing in the colonies? So we're asking this question because as we look at the relationship between England and her colonies, and as we see England, attempt to form a solid understanding as far as what powers the mother country has and what powers the colonies have, we want to keep in mind this idea of self-government. Two ideas of self-government, or two examples of self-government in the colonies. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you had the tradition of town meetings. That starts with the Mayflower Compact, establishing the precedent or the idea of majority rules. And then you see town meetings becoming a common feature in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's one of our first examples of something that would look like democracy. The other example of self-government would be in Virginia. We have the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is the first representative form of government in the colonies. It was created in 1619. However, once again, we want to put an asterisk beside that because we have to remember that the representation in the House of Burgesses was tied to wealth, and wealth is tied to the amount of land that you have. We will see, and if you've been doing your homework on the colonial tensions, you already have seen that system that was being put into place based on wealth will cause some social tension there, namely in the event of Bacon's Rebellion. All right, so England and her colonies. The whole purpose of the colonies was to make Great Britain rich. This is the idea or the theory of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the belief or the economic theory that a nation could become powerful and rich in two ways. Number one, they could obtain gold and silver. And number two, and this is where the colonies come in, they could establish a favorable balance of trade. And so this whole idea of establishing a favorable balance of trade is going to impact the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. A great example of how mercantilism impacted the relationship between colonies and the mother country would be the establishment of the Navigation Acts in 1651. These are a set of laws in which England will essentially England is making the colonies follow some general guidelines regarding trade so they could establish that favorable balance of trade for the mother country. The Navigation Acts say the following. Number one, colonies could export certain products only to England. Number two, goods traded to other countries had to first go through English ports. This way, the English could tax those goods before they sold them to countries like Spain, the Netherlands, or any other European country. These navigation laws were meant to allow England to use the colonies. Some would say exploit the colonies for financial gain. What effects the Navigation Acts have on both Britain and its colonies? Well, England obviously will get money. If the colonies could only export certain goods to England, they get money off of that. If the goods have to go through the English ports, and so the English could tax them, they will get money off of that. For the colonies, it's good and bad. The colonies, the positive, there is a tremendous shipbuilding boom, and there is an increased demand of goods and materials from England that will help out the northern colonies the most. The negative is that you'll see many people trying to get around these navigation acts, and you'll see instances of smuggling. You'll see that the British Crown will crack down on these smugglers and crack down on people resisting, these navigation acts. And you will see that the British Crown will eventually revoke or take away all the charters from the New England colonies and form what was called the Dominion of New England. The Dominion of New England is essentially just um, uh, one large one large colony under one royal governor. And so this takes place in 1685. James II is King of England, and he's going to crack down on the American colonies even more. He revokes all the charters from the New England colonies and forms one large colony called the Dominion of New England. The king is going to make a gentleman named Sir Edmund Andros the new royal governor of the Dominion. And Andros is going to cause some trouble. He's going to anger the colonists by outlawing local government and by forcing new taxes on the colonists. And so you see that the colonies have gotten used to the idea of self-government. And when this first example or this first instance of the British Crown trying to take self-government away from the colonies, you see a backlash. And so eventually in 1688, England will loosen its grip, and the new king and queen of England, William and Mary, they will restore the original colonies that made up the Dominion of New England. So they will give the original colonies their charters back, and they will restore that idea of self-government. It is at this time that England turns its attention away from the colonies and towards France. France is causing some trouble in Europe at this time. France is becoming one of England's largest rivals, and so they say, we will leave the colonies alone. We'll essentially let them do what they need to do, as long as they stay loyal to us, because we got bigger fish to fry. This policy of allowing the colonies to really govern themselves. This policy of rarely enforcing laws like the Navigation Acts, not closely supervising the colonies, this is known as salutary neglect. So from about 1688 to around 1760, the English will practice this policy of salutary neglect. That is, we are watching you, colonies, but we're going to let you do your own thing because, once again, we have bigger fish to fry. This policy had an important effect on colonial politics as well as economics. Both the British and the colonists benefited from this policy of salutary neglect. The colonists, they benefit from this policy because this is going to allow for self-government. And the British will benefit from this policy because as long as they are as long as they just want loyalty from the colonies and they're not going to really strictly enforce those trade laws, it actually turns out that the British have been able to preserve economic loyalty from the colonies. So it's a matter of, we're going to back off, and by backing off, the colonies actually have a little bit more respect for that economic arrangement between colonies and the mother country. So England will benefit from this in the sense that the colonies will continue to be loyal in that trading relationship between them and England. All right, so looking at some of the colonial regions, we want to first look at the agricultural South. And we know since the early days of Jamestown, John Rolfe, settlers in the South relied on tobacco as their cash crop. If you went down to South Carolina, that might change to rice or indigo. But in the South, these colonies relied on one major crop to sustain their economy. In the South, it's very rural, as we've mentioned before. Plantations instead of towns developed throughout the South. And the social order is in that feudal type pyramid. You have the large plantation owners at the top. then followed by the small farmers who may or may not own slaves. After that, you would have indentured servants, and at the bottom, you would have the slaves. There is a slight difference between indentured servants and slaves. Indentured servants are people who got their passage from Europe to the New World or to the colonies paid for by a plantation owner. This system was set up by something called the headright system. The headright system told the plantation owners that if you pay for somebody to come over to the colonies, that you will get an extra 50 acres of land. So plantation owners need in labor for their land and to grow their cash crop would pay for an indentured servant to come over. The plantation owner would get 50 acres of land through the headright system, and then they would get 5 to 7 years of labor from the indentured servant. So that means eventually the indentured servant could gain their freedom, and they would get something called freedom dues, which would be clothes, some food, and the ability to go out west into the frontier, which is the land that has not been settled yet, and establish a new life for themselves. You do see slavery start to develop in the mid 1600s. You'll start to see that the amount of indentured servants starts to go down in the second half of the 1600s. People are coming over in smaller and smaller numbers, looking for looking for somebody to pay their way to the New World. And so there starts to be a shift in the second half of the 1600s from the plantation owners to use slavery as their predominant source of labor. The other seminal event that is going to help this transition occur will be in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. You have a bunch of former indentured servants that have moved out west looking for land to settle. They come into conflict with the Native Americans out there. They appeal to the government back down in Jamestown to help them out in their fight against the Native Americans. And they feel that the governor and the House of Burgesses in Jamestown, they do not have the settlers' interest in mind. Bacon and his followers feel like the governor and the House of Burgesses only have their pocketbooks in mind and not the actual settlers' well-beings. And so Bacon will actually have a group of people turn against Jamestown and burn Jamestown to the ground in a revolt or a rebellion against the establishment back east. Now, Bacon will die shortly after this rebellion starts to take place, and the rebellion will be quickly put down. But this is going to be important because soon after Bacon's rebellion, you see that in an attempt to show or to establish some sort of bond between the lower class whites, plantation owners will shift to slavery. And so by the end of the 1600s and then into the 1700s, slavery will be the dominant labor force in the American South. Slavery starts to become entrenched, as I told you. We see the English gradually turn to the use of African slaves. And during the 17th century, the gradual or the increased use of African slaves is assisted in part by this growing transatlantic trade network known as a triangular trade route. The parts of the world that were involved in the triangular trade route were the English colonies, Europe, Africa, and the West Indies. And essentially, this is a network of trade routes crisscrossing the Atlantic. And for instance, New England would sell rum and other goods to Africa. Africa would then sell slaves to the West Indies. The West Indies would then use the slaves to create molasses and sugar, in which they would sell it to New England, so New England could create rum. And so this network of trade crisscrossing the Atlantic from the colonies to Europe and Africa back over to the West Indies and the colonies. It looks like a triangle, hence the name, the Triangle Trade Network. The Middle Passage was the middle leg of the Triangle Trade Network, and this was the leg that transported the Africans to the West Indies to be sold into slavery.